everyone. My name is Michael Goff, and I'm Principal Product Marketing here at Revenera, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webcast, Prescribing Success, How to Secure and Monetize Medical Devices. In the fast-moving world of medical devices, software is at the heart of innovation as producers transition from hardware-focused to subscription-based business models. And today, we're joined by Revenera's Alex Rybak, Senior Product Management Director, and Vic DeMarines, VP of Product Management for Software Monetization. And they're going to share some practical advice and best practices on ensuring software security and compliance with FDA and European regulations, streamlining operations through seamless remote software updates, and implementing modern monetization models to drive recurring revenue. Before we get started, let's go over a few housekeeping details. So first, today's discussion will be roughly 30 to 35 minutes long. If you have questions or comments along the way, please just add them to the Q&A tab, and we will try to answer them as we go along or at the end if time allows. And if we don't get to your questions, we will follow up with you individually after the event. We also have a number of resources available that build on today's topic, so please be sure to check out the Handouts tab where you can download the ones that look interesting to you. Finally, we will be sending you a link to the recording in the next 48 hours or so. So let's get started. Quality of patient care is obviously central to the role of medical devices. And as embedded software becomes more integral to these devices, it's really critical to ensure that you have the processes and systems in place to be successful. So today we're going to talk about how do you deliver a secure product? How do you make sure that those software updates get delivered to your devices? And then how can you use modern monetization models and technology to increase your profitability for these devices? So with that, let me hand things over to Alex, who will get us started. Alex?
All right. Thank you, Michael. Thanks, everybody, for joining. So healthcare security is business critical. And what I want to do is I really want to start by setting some context before we get into the conversation of kind of where we are in the market and why security is such an important topic. So we are kind of in a perfect storm for supply chain security. There's really four main drivers why that's the reality we live in. So first of all, as has been seen for the last decade or so, OSS growth continues to expand. We continue seeing developers leveraging open source technology, especially now with the Gen AI capabilities and making it easier for developers to adopt suggested code, which is often coming from open source repositories. There's lots of infrastructure libraries that people use. The use of package managers is pervasive these days. So we're really seeing a continued explosion in the use of open source technologies. We have an audit practice at Revenera where we scan customers' code and build a bill of material for them of the open source they use. And we are now up to about 3,500 parts in every single audit that we do. So that's the average number we're seeing, which usually accounts for 80% or higher of our modern applications. So lots of open source use, lots of different things coming in as part of the CI/CD and DevSecOps process. So really important to have guardrails and technology and tooling and policies to be able to control that. Along with that, we're also seeing security exploits continuing to increase, and not just in count, but also in sophistication and in their ultimate impact to organizations that are impacted by a security breach, a ransomware attack, or a supply chain attack. So we're definitely seeing that on the rise. We're seeing much more sophistication, not just somebody trying to hack through the front end of an application, but really sophisticated supply chain attacks where a vulnerable component may be placed into somebody's supply chain, a build occurs, software gets deployed, and at some point in the future, the vulnerability is exploited. So there's lots of different solutions that help deal with that, but that's a reality that people need to be aware of and have plans to mitigate. From the regulatory side, there's lots of different mandates around securing the software supply chain, around software bill of materials, so we'll talk about that. There's overarching regulations both in the United States with the Cybersecurity Executive Order, as well as in Europe with their Cyber Resilience Act. And then if you look across various industries, especially regulated ones, things like financial, medical, which is what we're focused on today, transportation, energy, there are regulations in all those areas, all those verticals that are specific to that industry. And we'll get into more details on that as well. And the other cause that's really driving kind of this perfect storm is just the fact that the software supply chain is really disconnected. Unlike the hardware supply chain where there's ERP systems, there's really good vetting of vendors, there's contracts in place to establish quality metrics. In software, there's lots of bottom-up use. There's lots of use where developers just arbitrarily select components, and therefore there's got to be a different process in place to mitigate that risk. So ultimately, the thing for everybody to really remember is you're liable for everything you distribute or host. So it doesn't matter who potentially made a mistake or introduced a security flaw upstream. You as the vendor, as the supplier, are ultimately responsible. So it is really imperative that you have the tools and processes in place to be able to control that. So let's start by kind of talking about who's involved, right? So we've always talked about cybersecurity really becoming a global movement. It is a global movement. We've gotten to a point where anytime any regulatory body releases a document, a best practice, any sort of regulatory updates, there's lots of different groups involved. You can see on the left here, lots of different agencies in the United States, lots of different agencies in the EU, and certainly lots of countries around the world involved, which is great. Right? The goal here is to have regulations that are consistent across the globe and have kind of standard policies and best practices and frameworks so that it is easier to operate on a global scale, specifically since most companies today sell worldwide. So it's really important that there's consistency in the regulations. So let's talk about the medical industry. So medical industry certainly has an action plan. In the US, we've got the FDA that's responsible for Food and Drug Administration. They're responsible for regulating medical devices. In Europe, we've got the MDR, which is medical device regulations. Both of these have overarching cybersecurity best practices and guidelines. Both of these ultimately roll up to the overarching policies set by their governments. And ultimately, they are consistent in that they try to emphasize that managing cybersecurity risk throughout a medical device's entire life cycle is imperative, right? And we're talking about both pre and post-release. So there's a set of rules and constraints before a particular medical device or technology is released. And also, once something is released, what has to be done as far as an update cadence, the quality of updates, the type of cybersecurity scanning that needs to be done. So really, there's kind of a two-pronged approach before you release something and then monitoring and updating things as they're released. So a couple points on these regulations. So in the US, we have the FDA cyber regulations. They were recently revised, so there's a whole new set of up-to-date regulations. They primarily focus on medical devices that have cybersecurity risk. So anything that is connected to the network, anything that contains software, anything that has any sort of digital update capability. So anything that's online and driven by software is in scope for the regulations. These regulations apply to new pre-market submissions, right? So there is a certain period of time you have to go back to, but you don't have to go back to anything that was released many, many years ago. However, anything that has a significant change or a patch or a new release is in scope for the regulations. And as I mentioned earlier, they're really split into two parts. There's a pre-market requirement to demonstrate that you have done an industry standard approach to security testing, to scanning, running software composition analysis tools to understand what is inside your software, and producing SBOMs as a way to communicate the composition to your customers. And then post-market requirements really focus on monitoring, identifying risk, addressing any sort of reported cybersecurity vulnerabilities and exploits, and making sure that you are consistently improving your processes and patching the software that is going to your hardware devices. In Europe, very similar. Regulations apply to manufacturers, to authorized representatives, importers or distributors of medical devices in the EU. And really, they talk about kind of three main things. So number one, manufacturers must identify vulnerabilities and potential exploits in their devices. They must design, develop, and maintain devices with robust cybersecurity features, so similar to what the FDA recommends. And they have to be timely on their updates and patches. So essentially what this really means is you need to have a security framework. You need to make sure that you have policies, that you have controls in place in your organization, and that you are continuously working and improving your process. So a lot of this is already in place in most organizations. It just needs to be something that has people accountable for it, that making sure your teams are trained and making sure that you are running your own process. So let's talk about SBOMs. So this is a very popular topic in the industry, and SBOM is essentially a software bill of material. Think of it as kind of an ingredients label for your software applications. It is a formal and queryable record, right? SBOMs are intended to be digitally communicated across organizations and machine readable, which is very important to scale. It needs to have details and relationships of what are the building blocks of your software. So if you look at the green bubbles on the left, these are typically things that are scanned to identify composition and generate a bill of material. So things like executables, commercial libraries, proprietary software, open source components, whether they are components brought in through package managers or whether it's a copy paste snippet, for example, all of these things are in scope to make it into a software bill of material. For every element of the bill of material, which are called SBOM parts, well, essentially what you have is information about the supplier, information about the component and version that represents that part, any sort of dependency information, which is really important because if you're going to go fix something or demand that your vendor fixes something, you need to understand how it got there. You need to know the provenance of how the component came in, author names, so you understand who's responsible for developing the component, licenses that cover the use of the component, making sure that you're compliant with your legal policies, and security vulnerabilities. And there are various reports to not only represent which vulnerabilities are associated with components, but which ones are actually exploitable and relevant depending on how your application works. So there's vulnerability disclosure reports, vulnerability exploitation reports, and these are really important as companions to the bill of material to make sure you understand the security posture at any given point in time. In the resources tab, there's a couple links around a webinar that we did in the past around SBOMs, and also CISA, which is the US Cybersecurity Agency. They've got lots of great resources around the software bill of material. So why are SBOMs important? Well, they're important because vulnerability management is critical to the device's security risk management process. Software bill of material gives you inventory of what is inside the application. It helps you track vulnerabilities for components you're using and understand when you may have a problem. It provides transparency for your customers and regulatory authorities, and it helps you understand your risk and allows you to act accordingly based on the data. So it's a really critical artifact for you to have in a company. Even if it's not something you share, it's still a really good thing to invest in building because it helps you drive your program, understanding the catalog of components that you're using. So the other thing that's really important to understand is you've got to go from kind of insight to action, right? It's good to understand that you have risks, but it's really important to make sure that you drive the process. So whatever tooling you're putting in place, whatever applications you use for scanning and correlating various security information, you really need to maintain control. And to do so, there's 5 critical questions that you need to be able to answer with your process. So number 1 is, do we know what is inside our product, right? Do we have a bill of material constructed, regularly updated, and do we understand to our level of risk mitigation what is inside the software that drives our medical devices? Right? Do we know at any given point what components we have, their dependencies, and if we need to fix something, do we know the path to remediation or mitigation to work around it? Number 2, which is critically important, is do we have a policy? And having a policy, do we know if we have any sort of legal and or security compliance issues? Just like your bill of material changing release to release, your policy needs to be fluid, right? It needs to be something that is periodically reviewed. Very often there will be licensing changes in open source components. There may be changes in your risk threshold or regulatory requirements. So you need to make sure your policy is documented, that your teams are trained on it, and that is reviewed and revised over time. And the third thing that's important is your tooling needs to be able to tell you if you're exposed to a specific security issue. If there is a breach in industry, if there's a newsworthy event, you need to be able to go into your system, run a query, interrogate the vulnerability, and understand which components, which applications, where they're deployed, which customers have received your software, and where you have to do patching. The next item, which is also important, is are your components up to date? Right? Even if something doesn't have vulnerability against it, open source typically doesn't age very well. So you don't want to be on components that are years old, even if there are no reported vulnerabilities. Typically, as things age out, their security risk goes up. So you want to make sure you're staying up to date, you're taking latest releases, and that you are refreshing your dependencies in your applications. And then really kind of the most important thing and why all of this is done is to understand where the risk is and how do you mitigate or how do you remediate, right? And having these types of tools deployed will help you do that. Okay, so I wanted to talk about one example of one of our healthcare customers, right? This customer is in the healthcare as a service industry, right? They provide managed services around healthcare. And the way that they really went about it, and this is a really good way to kind of start the process, is there is an organization out there called OpenChain, and it's an open source community essentially that has two different ISO specifications. There is 5230, which is the specification for license compliance program. And then they also have a specification around a security compliance program. And this customer leveraged those specifications to really help set up and drive their open source program office, as well as their internal regulatory compliance program. If you look at the key elements in the program that they established, number one, education, which is critically important because you have to make sure that your teams are enabled to succeed, that they understand what's expected of them, and they understand the accountability or consequences of not doing their job. So education is key. Policy, right? The way you would educate is you develop a policy and then you train people on how your company needs to comply with your policies. What's acceptable, what's not acceptable, what is the frequency of work that you do, what do you do if there's an issue, how much of this can be automated so that there is not too much manual work in the process. All of that should be part of your policy. All of this ultimately is underpinned by developing and collecting quality data and making informed decisions on that data, and then being able to self-manage with having some independent oversight and reporting. So working with go-to-market partners, working with vendors for your tooling, understanding best practices, working with your customers, perhaps a coalition along with other industry participants that are in the same market as you are. All of that, it really goes into having a better policy and a better process. And really the outcome that was driven by this is having a continuous and automated management process that is designed with security in mind from design all the way to release, deployment, and monitoring, which is really critical because you definitely don't want to bolt on security as an afterthought. It needs to be designed from the ground up as part of your entire development process. And then the final thing I really want to focus on is, so what are some best practices to get started, right? Let's say you're at a low level of maturity of complying with this and you're looking for ways to get going. Here's kind of the three-step process that I would always advocate. So number one is make sure you operate within a security framework. Now, chances are, if you are in a large organization, you have a security framework in place. Talk to your CISO, talk to your IT and engineering teams, find out what it is, and make sure that people are trained on what the requirements of the program are and that they understand their role in it. This program needs to include static security testing, dynamic security testing, software composition analysis, making sure as much of that is automated as possible, but not forgetting that a manual pen test, for example, is also really important as kind of an overall system test that will find things that automated testing may miss. Once you have the framework in place, develop and maintain your policy, right? That's the next really critical part, which is understanding what the rules are and how you have to comply with them, and making sure that anything that you use with respect to open source or third-party code is documented. You understand licensing implications, and you understand the security posture of things you bring in. And then start creating bill of materials. Even if you're not doing it today, there's lots of tools out there, both free and commercial. Start creating them, make sure they improve over time, make sure that your level of depth and analysis is increasing over time, and making sure that these SBOMs are not just created and stashed, but they're actually actionable, that you're looking at them, your customers are looking at them, and you're using it to drive and improve your process. Okay, with that, I will hand it over to Vic to talk about software updates.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. That was a great review. And really in this part of the presentation, I wanted to talk, we saw the requirements, right? The regulatory requirements and also the requirements, frankly, to handle your business risk with ensuring timely updates to your software. So how do we manage the software and our updates? How do you make sure your customers are staying current? How do you track that? What's the traceability that you have? And also, gaining insights from that process so that you can better monetize and then improve your the mechanism in which you update your applications or your firmware or your devices. So what are some of the challenges? Well, frequency is a big one. We just talked about the security vulnerabilities. Actually, I have an interesting stat here that Alex was able to kind of find where software vulnerabilities are at an all-time high, over 26,000 disclosed in 2023. That's a 5% year-on-year increase. If you want to see some additional detail on that, the Qualys Research Lab report can provide that. But that puts pressure on a system to automate, to provide a quicker way to update an application, not have so much human dependency on the process itself, increase the frequency, and also the scale. Because when we're talking about medical devices, whether it's a tablet, whether it's sensitive machines within a hospital, or even services, we need to make sure that it can scale for that growth without having to introduce additional dependencies and manual processes. So what are the benefits if we get that right, or if we put a system together that can actually automate this? Well, automation leads to more efficiency. It leads to more frequency and flexibility to introduce an update in the field. Go from maybe that once a year to maybe even daily or once a week in terms of an update, because you now can rely upon an automated process versus having that manual process. You can also stop revenue leakage. And what is that? Well, that's kind of a unique hook to when we talk about software and managing software updates. We want to make sure that the intellectual property, the applications themselves are being rolled out to those that are entitled to it, to your customers that you have a relationship with. They're in good standing, what their entitlements are up to date, that their subscriptions are active. You want to make sure that this software is being rolled out in that fashion automatically versus having to do a manual check. And when we talk about that system, so the software or IoT monetization platform, you're going to have a lot of connection points. You're going to have the ability of providing insight to how users are accessing the applications or devices, what they're enabled to do with that software. You're also from a collection of data, and not necessarily personally identifiable data, just transactional information on the usage of those products, whether you've had updates or patches and how well they've been adopted or installed on those different devices. Those are your touch points into that software monetization platform. And really the center of that is your customers, the way you monetize your products, and also the insights and the analytics that go along with that. And kind of speaking to analytics, so the level of granularity, and there's an example just within our system of what you should expect. I have an organization, they're entitled to an application, an update's been pushed out. You want to understand both the success and failure from a compliance perspective. You want to understand that the installation of that update was complete, and you have the date and timestamp for it, and you can then report against this from all the accounts that you may just had a recent vulnerability and an update's been pushed out. You also want to have the process that can trigger some notifications to your backend systems. A central IoT monetization platform doesn't exist by itself. There are your CRM applications, there are quoting and your order management type applications that also have to be updated. So there should be a process in place to provide more automatic notifications to those type of applications. So we see the system is needed for updating products and applications, and it needs to be automated. And we'll talk a bit more about what we mean by a central IoT monetization platform. But the overall goal is making sure that we deliver these quickly and accurately to our organizations, but we do it within the constraint of our business models, and that there's enough analytics to allow us to understand not just the traceability of those updates, but grow our business as we try to evolve from a business model. And I just put this slide up here because the world's changed quite a bit, right? It used to be all hardware, right? And that's how we differentiate ourselves. And especially from a medical device perspective, there's more differentiation now in the software as well as the hardware, and even into the data itself and the data that's been collected. Think of clinical research data, where you want to even monetize that or the access to that data. And you may want to do that in different ways. You may want to do it purely subscription, pay per use, or some usage-based criteria in terms of monetization model. So it's an awesome opportunity for organizations or producers out there that have these different types of environments, but it also does introduce another complexity in terms of, well, how do I manage this? How do I manage the different monetization models to enhance my business and become profitable, right? So when we look at those different, if we were an organization that had these different services from software, hardware to the data itself, then you're going to want to be able to create additions of that product. You want to have the flexibility of choosing which monetization model is right for those different applications and collecting the usage data so you can test that hypothesis and have the overall analytics to show how well you're doing, and right down to what the features and add-ons that you're adding to a product. So that comes along with a monetization platform. And what I wanted to do is maybe step back a little bit and talk about one of our largest healthcare device customers, and really from a before and after perspective. So the before they had this IoT monetization platform, there was a lot of physical distribution of media, DVD drives, field engineers going out to sites, to hospitals, to installations, and updating software, and performing manual entitlement checks at the same time. And certainly this is going to increase cost. It's going to take away valuable resources in the field for just doing installation type activity. And after they implemented an IoT monetization platform, which didn't happen overnight, they were able to do this in an incremental fashion. They made sure they started with one business unit, and then as they got more proficient in automating the process, then rolled in other products over time. But they were able to integrate the monetization platform with their quoting and order management, having that entitlement data shared also with other back-end business systems, and introduce a automated electronic software delivery system. And it's not just files that are being delivered, but actually container. Their applications actually are resident within some critical medical devices like MRI machines, and they're leveraging Kubernetes deployment techniques to update those applications. So they were able to speed their digital delivery, which helped them with their security stance, gave them a much more repeatable process and a more frequent way of updating that software. They were also able to, with that entitlement management, have traceability to those end user organizations that have been updated and also what their entitlement status was. This minimized really the people that are needed on site. And that was timely because with the advent of COVID, when they implemented the system, they didn't have those people that they could rely upon. So having that automation allowed them to maintain their software license agreements. And that was certainly a big payoff for them. So I did want to talk about the analytics. When we look at a centralized monetization platform, the expectation is that you have a single warehouse where your data is stored. And this data would include what devices, what applications have been updated, who has access to that data, your end user accounts, your partner accounts, all those things are centralized within that system. And even to the device level, we're understanding at any point in time how those devices are allocating access to the end users and what are those access rights. With that kind of view, you can certainly build a predictive model for your business. And that would include also looking for upsell indicators, renewal risk indicators, having customer success people being able to access that data to understand at any point in time how well that account is doing. And then even build in more customized notifications based on the historical record that would allow you to push information to other back-end systems and further automate that chain of events with your monetization platform. And so when we look at that platform again in total, we can connect the opportunity there is I can be able to monetize really any type of application, not just an intelligence device, but a service or a hybrid cloud type of application, as well as an on-premise application. I could do it at the feature or capacity level. I can start to implement a reoccurring revenue model earlier in the process. And I can enhance the end customer experience because that data can be reflected back to them via a self-service portal. So they're in control of who has access to the software and they know exactly what's being adopted. And then, as I mentioned, because you have this insight now, you have kind of connected all the points along this life cycle of monetization, you're able to build your dashboards and your key performance indicators so you can track how well you're doing and how profitable your business is being. So, that's it for the presentation. I'll bring Mike back onto stage and Alex. I can't hear you, Mike. I don't know if that's just me.
It said turn on camera and mic. Apparently it only did one. Software, it's awesome. So I'll restate the question. So Alex, you talked about some of the best practices, and you mentioned folks who are on the lower end of the SBOM maturity curve, but what are some of the best ways for them to get started and what support is available to them?
Sure, yeah, good question. So let me jump back to this slide. I think this is kind of a good map, right, if you're going to get started. And we talked about kind of 3 steps, right? So make sure you got security framework, make sure you've got a robust policy. Both of those are dynamic, right? They're going to change over time, make sure they are updated, and get in the habit of generating SBOMs. Now, so that's good as general guidance. How do you do it, right? So I would say the best place to start, at least it was for me, is get familiar with OpenChain. And I'll put a link in the chat here for folks who are not aware of them. So they are an industry group. They're really good to work with around how do you put a process in place for license management as well as security management. They've got 2 different ISO specifications around, or ISO standards around their specifications. So 5230 for licensing and 18974 for security. It is very easy to work with it. It doesn't tell you what to do. It tells you what is a checklist against whatever program you define, and making sure that it's robust and adequate for industry best practices. So that's number 1. The other thing that I think is very helpful is get engaged with industry groups, right? So there's 2 different formats for software bill of material, SPDX, which is the software package data exchange format, and CycloneDX. Both of those have communities. Both of those have regular meetings. It's good to be involved. You'll understand kind of how the standard's evolving, how to comply with it, how to generate various SBOMs, how to interpret them. So good to get involved there. CISA, and we've got a link in the handouts towards that. They've got lots of different tracks for producers, for consumers, for executives, for security teams. So there's lots of kind of different perspective best practice guidelines on what to do around SBOM. And then OpenChain has its own community and set of meetings. So get involved, talk to peers, talk to your customers, really understand what they need from you and how you can make them successful, which will then in turn drive your program and improve it over time. And I'll pop a link in the chat here.
Thanks, Alex. And Vic, you obviously talked a lot about analytics. And in general, can you talk a little bit more about some of the key metrics that, manufacturers of medical devices should be looking at to sort of, you talked about engagement. I would think that also, you're keeping track of, which updates have gone out, but maybe talk a little bit more about key metrics and then maybe alerting and notifying end users as to sort of the current state of things.
Well, I think just kind of breaking down the key metrics, certainly from the updates perspective, when you're handling a vulnerability and you're pushing out those application updates, understanding kind of what's the risk within your end user community, that's a key performance metric, and how well you're diminishing that risk over time. And that's certainly going to come from the analytics itself, and understanding what has been delivered, what has not been successfully installed or pushed out. And you're not in control of all those things, but you at least should be able to build the KPI to understand how well you've done with a particular update with your applications. And then I think from the business perspective, building those KPIs around the performance or the renewal risk are key ones. I think when we talk to customers, there's 2 flavors that they're looking for. They're looking for active accounts. They're looking for the churn as well, and trying to put a metric around that so they could chart that they could display that at any point in time for who they have to present to. And then from an opportunity perspective, the upsell is probably the most interesting, especially if you're using a monetization platform. If you have a device or an application that's connected to the system and you see that the utilization is or that your customers are underutilizing the features and capabilities you're putting out there, and you have a metric for it, and you have a way of being notified when it hits that percentage, then you're at a pretty mature point from an analytic perspective to respond to that and to kind of link in other processes to help take advantage of that data.
Yeah, great points. One last question for you, Vic. So you did talk a little bit about building right-size offerings. And that's always interesting, right? So we've got hardware, but now we have software-driven features that are available to push out to end customers. It could depend on what tier of functionality they want. One of the interesting things about that is a lot of device manufacturers now are reducing the number of SKUs that they have to support by having a sort of base unit and then having those software-driven features. Can you talk a little bit more about that? We didn't really cover it too much, but you touched upon it a little bit.
Yeah, so I think that is a general trend, is simplifying, especially to the customer, what they're purchasing from a software, and looking at designing a monetization model that takes advantage of that. Now, the overall definition of a product may mean many things, and internally to the producer, they may still be tracking that at a feature level. They still have that broken up from value, but from a customer perspective, they're trying to make it very easy for them to adopt that product and not be so reliant on understanding the underlying features of that product. They may have additions of the product they put together, or they might be doing a usage-based model that is consuming that capability. But in the analytics and what's being reported back, of course, are those differentiating features that are being consumed as part of that product. Still a very key component and metric for the organization to take advantage of, and to then package their products in such a way that is differentiated and has the highest value for their end customers.
Great. So I don't see any other questions. So gentlemen, thank you very much, Alex, Vic, for sharing your experience and your insights today. It's always great hearing from you and getting your perspective. And thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us today. Please be sure to let us know if you have any follow-up questions. Again, we will be sending out a link to the recording shortly, but if anything we didn't cover or anything you think of after the webinar, feel free to reach out. So with that, thank you again for joining us, and have a great day.
Thanks all.